Hello class, this is our final lesson on conservation and biodiversity. Some objectives for this lesson. We're going to talk about biodiversity and how it's actually a relationship between rates of extinction and speciation, benefits to humanity, significant threats such as habitat loss, exotic species hunting, predicted effects of climate change, some conservation techniques that we're trying to preserve biodiversity with, the effects of habitat restoration, and the role of zoos as it occurs to conservation. So when we think of biodiversity, we're thinking of a push and pull between speciation, the creation of new species, and extinction. Now, extinction is a natural process. It is the loss of animal life of species from the earth. And there's always sort of a background extinction going on. But in the current era, we are seeing approximately 500 to 1,000 times increase in that rate. So we are probably in a mass extinction now. This will come up later, but seems like we're entering what is called the Holocene era. So with this is probably going to continue to accelerate in the coming centuries, and this will be due to human activities such as cutting down the forest for agriculture. So for instance, between 1970 and 2011, 20% of the Amazon rainforest was lost, and some areas of the globe are actually having even higher rates of deforestation than that. So here's an example of the Amazon, where the forest is being cut down for cattle ranching and farming. So what is biodiversity? Well, it covers a wide range of things. So the variety of biological systems, usually portrayed as the number of species, but truthfully, there's a genetic perspective, there is a chemicals perspective, and we can apply this even to the ecosystem level. So genetic diversity is one way that we tend to think about this, the variety of genes and alleles as they occur in an ecosystem. But can be construed as the sum of all the metabolic compounds. And so ecosystems, of course, number and variety of ecosystems on Earth or in a geographical area. So very broad. So greater diversity allows greater species to exist. So for instance, coral reef all the way to different prairies. So we really don't understand well how many current species there are, and so this poses a problem for conservation because we are losing species that we haven't even described yet. And so a recent estimate says there are about 1.5 million species of eukaryotes described, and this is estimated to be less than 20% of the total. So there's still a lot of life out there to be found, and the numbers of prokaryotic species is even higher because we've only recently begun to even be able to study them. So the State of Observed Species reports 17,000 to 20,000 new species every year. At this rate, it will take us 500 years to even describe the species that are alive now. So extinction then is just the disappearance of species from the earth. And so areas of high biodiversity would be, for example, rainforest. And these areas of high diversity mean that the biodiversity of the planet is not actually evenly distributed. And a great example is a threat to high regions of biodiversity would be the introduction of exotic species. So for instance, Lake Victoria contained over 500 species of cichlids. This was a great example of this sympatric speciation where the cichlids radiated out to fill very many niches. But due to introduction of exotic species in the 80s and 90s, there was a mass extinction event for these cichlids. So we would consider them to be endemic because the cichlids were only found in that one location. As mentioned, biodiversity tends to be highest around the tropics, and it's probably due to the complexity of these tropical ecosystems. Lots of canopy, lots of different habitat partitioning. This habitat heterogeneity is leading to a number of ecological niches that support many different species. So why do we care? Well, there are benefits for us. For example, human health implications, of course, agricultural implications, wild food sources. We still hunt, we still rely on food pulled from the environment. But many medications are actually derived from a diverse group of organisms, and there's still much to be discovered pharmaceutically out in these areas of high biodiversity. We take advantage of these secondary plant compounds. So normally they are toxins or used by the plant for defense, but we can take advantage of them and they can work as human medicines. One of my favorite examples of this is digitalis, the foxglove, has a beautiful flower and it is full of cardiac glycosides, so these very potent toxins, but in the right dosage it can be used as a heart medicine. Of course, agriculturally there are some implications here. Our plants are monocultured. They have very low genetic diversity. One way that you can increase genetic diversity in our crops is to go back and look at their original versions. And you can actually incorporate these wild genes into our crops. And so it's important that we need to keep these original crops around as well. And of course, using wild populations for food, of course, mostly aquatic in the harvest of fish. It's very important to us, and we need to work on conservation towards that. So the Madagascan periwinkle has medicinal properties, including this vincristine, a drug used in lymphoma. So what sort of threats are there to biodiversity? Well, of course, habitat loss, that cutting down the rainforest for ranches. I mean, you're getting rid of the environment and the organisms there are not suited to live anywhere else. When you eliminate their habitat, that will kill the individual species. Overharvesting, of course, aquatic species is mentioned. You take too many fish, there aren't enough fish left to keep the population going. And so there is a problem with the tragedy of the commons in which these fishers have no motivation to exercise restraint, because you catch more fish, you sell more fish, and really they don't own the fisheries, so it's not a problem to them. You also have things like bushmeat. We have tied bushmeat back to several outbreaks of these sort of zoonotic pathogens. And so this is the wild animals that are killed for food and then sold in marketplaces. Of course, things like COVID have been implicated as being from bushmeat, but really we don't know. But exotic species. So anytime you bring species from somewhere and put them somewhere else, there's always the threat that they're going to outcompete the natives and do better. And they can also carry pathogens as well. So chytrid mycosis in amphibians is thought to be from introduced species, sort of a parasitic fungus, and then white nose fungus in bats. Climate change is also a threat to biodiversity. We do have identified this sort of anthropogenic warming trend, possibly due to us digging up and burning carbon sources. This is recognized as a major extinction threat, because as the world warms, ecosystems are going to change. If the oceans warm, it becomes much harder for organisms with shells to actually build those shells. So what's going to happen there? This is a serious threat. So here in this figure we have a bat with the white nose syndrome, a very deadly syndrome introduced presumably by a exotic species. So preservation of biodiversity. We are trying to meet this challenge by getting information. So we need more information. We need to understand the biodiversity. We need to catalog and recognize these species, and then we need to change our behavior in such a way that we are not threatening them. And so we can integrate these preservation strategies with this information and use that to encourage our biodiversity conservation. So biodiversity itself, relationship of function of speciation and extinction. Paleontologists looking at the fossil record have been able to identify areas of mass die-offs that show a loss, a dramatic loss in biodiversity. We call these the 5 mass extinctions, and it appears we're in a 6th, the Holocene. And this is mostly to do with the activities of Homo sapiens. And so an example of the species loss would be dodo birds, but in truth, it's almost like we've been waging a 100,000-year war on any animal larger than a small dog. When you look back at the fossil record, these organisms did not survive the Ice Age with us, and human pressure is thought to have played a role in this. So extinction intensity is reflected in the fossil record. Of course, will fluctuate. Sometimes there are areas of great speciation where you have a lot of biodiversity. Sometimes there are events that trigger losses of this biodiversity. So in trying to estimate the present day extinction, we have some challenges. For example, we just don't know how these species are being affected by things like climate change and habitat loss. It's going unobserved essentially. So the extinction rate then is the number of species becoming extinct over time. The background extinction rate is estimated to be about 1 per million species year. And one contemporary extinction rate uses the extinctions rate written since we've started recording species back in the 1500s. Some people use a species area relationship. This is the rate at which new species are seen when the area surveyed is increased. And so this is how you get this species area curve. It's a cumulative number of species found as more and more area is sampled. And so this is one way to try and estimate. So how do we actually conserve biodiversity? Well, we have to recognize the threats first, and then we need to set aside these preserves. For example, the national park system of the U.S. The first was the Yellowstone Park in 1872. You can change human behavior. You can put laws on the books, legislation. So laws to protect hunting of endangered species and to regulate hunting and fishing overall. Setting up preserves, so establishment of wildlife and ecosystem preserves, especially in biodiversity hotspots. So these are geographical regions with large number of endemic species. You can restore habitat. So for instance, in areas where you have deforested, you can allow the forest to reclaim it. And then zoos and captive breeding. So I realize that zoos do not always have a great opinion by some people, but they do play a role with these captive breeding programs and education and outreach on the benefits of conservation. So here is a map of 34 identified biodiversity hotspots. These biodiversity hotspots only cover 2.3% of the Earth's surface. And that is the end of this short lecture on biodiversity and conservation.